There's one point in the movie, he goes into this little kind of hut that he's built for himself where he has a turntable. Then he starts flipping through his records. Well, the last one that you see as he's flipping through there, here is Asia's debut album. Robert John Hadfield here from Audiomover, here to talk about some classic vinyl. And I'm so excited to talk about this record today. If you were alive back in the early 80s and were in the music scene and saw what was going on, you definitely heard this album. This album is so important to so many people. I mean, it was amazing when this thing came out. The songs that came off of this, the production, this was a true supergroup right here. And I'll tell you, the reason I pulled this one out, the thing that got me thinking about this, was I was watching the movie Oblivion. I work in a recording studio, and a lot of times I'm sitting in a video editing area and I'm just going through footage and editing things. And so I'll sometimes have a movie on in the background. Well, I have Oblivion on, which is a Tom Cruise movie that I happen to like. And so I thought, I'm going to throw that on and play that again. Well, if you've ever seen that movie, there's one point in the movie where he goes to this kind of hideaway that he has on this futuristic Earth, but he's found this little place where he kind of lives in the past, and that has this little pond and grass and what have you. And anyway, so he goes into this little kind of hut that he's built for himself where he has a turntable. And I just, for some reason, hadn't thought to pay attention to this before, but then he starts flipping through his records, and I go, oh my gosh, and I'm noticing I have a bunch of the records that he's flipping through. Well, the last one that you see as he's flipping through there, here is Asia's debut album. And I thought, oh my gosh, because, that they picked that one. You figure, they're making this movie and somebody thought about which albums do we want to show as as he's flipping through these, and they picked this one. And rightfully so, this album had such a massive impact. It was so huge. The music was so great. And it was this super group that was made up of these four guys that were, John Wetton, who had previously been in King Crimson. That was the first time most people really ever heard of him. And then he did a short stint in Roxy Music, and he was in Uriah Heep for a moment, and then he started his own little group called UK, and then he had a solo album, and then he got together with Steve Howe, who was with Yes. And so Steve Howe was just a really, really well-known guitarist because he'd been with Yes. And then you had Carl Palmer, who had been in Emerson, Lake and Palmer, so everybody was familiar with that already. And then you had the last person, whose name was Jeffrey Downes. And Jeffrey Downes had been in the band The Buggles, and then he'd also been in the band Yes. And so these four guys got together, and it was just these really amazing musicians, and they put this album together. And it got so much bigger than I think anybody ever expected it to. This thing sold over time somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million copies. And so all these guys had come from, as you listen to that list right there, all these guys have a really progressive rock background. And then to come together and put something that ended up having actual singles, which is not something you traditionally think of with progressive music, progressive rock music. It was, you start thinking about progressive rock, you start thinking about Jethro Tull, you start looking at all these groups that have, entire album sides are one song. And then to have this group of people together that are all from these progressive rock bands, Jeffrey Downes was in the Buggles, which had a hit single, but he had been in Yes. And so when you put all these guys together, you're expecting these epic, these massive things. And there was definitely hints of progressive rock all over this thing, but they really had hits, and they had great songs on this. Now this one really has a personal place for me too, because this was my second concert. I saw these guys in I guess it would have been 1982, 83. I don't remember when the tour came through, but as some of you know, I'm originally from Denver, Colorado. And we saw them on this tour, and they played at Red Rocks. Now, a lot of people watching this have probably been in Red Rocks Amphitheater before. It's a legendary place to play music, to do a concert. I mean, you have the who's who of famous music, and you're going to find almost everybody that's ever been on any level of success, or has played there. It's a big deal, and partly because, it's an open area. It's this natural amphitheater, and the sound in that place, because it's an open area and because of the way the rocks are formed around it, is just incredible there. You go see a band indoors and in an arena, and oftentimes you're just listening to mud, unless you're right next to the mixing board, where the sound engineer's hearing it and you're getting the best sound possible. But a lot of times in an arena, it's very muddy, and you don't get that really pure sound that you can get when you're outside, because the sound isn't echoing around everywhere. It just kind of goes off. Well, Red Rocks is just the epitome of what you want when you're in an outdoor amphitheater. And it's beautiful too. You're outdoors, you've got these massive rocks around you. Anyway, so back in those days, when you would go to Red Rocks, there was no reserved seating. It was all, you'd get there, you'd sleep over at night, the night before, and, get in as soon as the doors open. It was all general admission back then. So we got there early in the morning, and I spent the entire day just sitting, waiting for the concert to start. And I'll tell you, I was 13, 14 years old at the time, and I still remember John Wetton's voice just going through that amphitheater. And I think Asia is the story of these, these progressive rock musicians, but in some ways it's the story of John Wetton. He'd had this long career up until this moment, and he was really the guy that started this group. He'd been encouraged to do something like this for a while, so he wrote, along with Jeffrey Downes, most of this music on here. And not only was the music great, but he has one of the most beautiful, pure voices in rock music. It was so amazing. And I still, like I said, I still remember what that was like, being at Red Rocks and listening to his voice just going through that canyon. And then the sound was just so amazing. And this was not the kind of group that you go and they put on a big show and craziness. These were progressive rock musicians, and that, usually that meant they were just standing playing their instruments, and there was not a lot of show. It was more about, we're going to give you some really, really excellent sound and some excellent music. And that's really what happened here. I think a lot of people remember this album cover. This album cover was done by a guy named Roger Dean. Now, Roger Dean the reason they worked with him is because he had done a lot of Yes album covers. Matter of fact, Fragile, which is one of Yes's best known albums, is the one that has a roundabout on it. That was done by Roger Dean. And he has this just kind of, this surreal kind of look that he does. And there was some question, they were a little bit concerned about using him because of that connection to Yes. They were trying to be their own thing. But they ended up working with him, and they just got this classically just amazing album cover. And the last song to be written by the band was probably maybe their biggest single on there, which was called Heed the Moment. And in that song, there's the line, it's the end of the second verse as I recall, and it says, "You catch a pearl and ride the dragon's wings." And I've read it both ways, but it appears that was inspired by this album cover. And it's such a great line, "You catch a pearl and ride the dragon's wings." And you look at this amazing image, anyway, this was just so spectacular. There was just this amazing thing looking at this artwork from the cover of this album. So anyway, that's pretty awesome stuff. Let's flip this over and take a look at this other side. You see on the flip side, it's a continuation of the front side. And here we have the song list and then the band members. And there's Jeffrey Downes, like I said, keyboards and vocals. Steve Howe, guitar and vocals. Carl Palmer, drums and percussion. And John Wetton, lead vocal and bass guitar. He has an interesting story about how he got involved with playing the bass guitar. His brother was a church organist. And if you know anything about the organ is not only, you know, these layers of keyboards that you play with your hands, but an organ generally has foot pedals too to play all the bass notes. It's the really deep bass stuff. And when his brother was practicing the organ at his home, what they had was a piano, and so his brother would play would play on there, and then John would play the low bass notes on would play the low bass notes that were missing from the organ. And then that's how, you know, if you listen to John talk about this, that's how he got this connection of understanding music, understanding how it's organized, understanding how chords work and how the bass interacts with the melodies. And so then, you know, that's what he really does now, you know, is that he became the bass player, and then he was also doing the melodies because he understood this connection between the two from years of you know, being around church music, learning music with his brother. And so it was, anyway, it's kind of a neat thing. Of course, when I say plays, he passed away several years ago, and so John Wetton's no longer with us. Now, you'll notice down here, if you can see that, this is on Geffen Records. For a lot of people, this is the first time we ever even heard of Geffen Records. Now, Geffen, he was a pretty known entity in the world of music, but as I understand it, Asia really was the first band. You know, Geffen had picked up some other artists, but this was the first band that they had signed to Geffen, and man, what a success! You know, right off the bat was to get something like this that sells this massive amount of records. The other thing that you can't underestimate about what was going on at the time was the connection to MTV, because MTV was huge now at this point. And of course, music videos were in their infancy. You know, the music videos for the two really big hit songs, which were Heat of the Moment and Only Time Will Tell, were just as, in my opinion, just as underwhelming as most other videos were at the time. But music videos were a huge deal. Now, there's something really interesting about that too, related to this album and this band and why MTV was such a big deal, and it is Jeffrey Downs. If you don't realize it, Jeffrey Downs, I think I mentioned this a second ago, the band that he was with before this, you know, not only had he played in Yes, but he was in this band called the Buggles. And where have you heard of the Buggles before? The Buggles had a song, a hit song called Video Killed the Radio Star. And Video Killed the Radio Star was the first song played on MTV. So Jeffrey Downs was you know, in the DNA of MTV, just because he'd written that song, Video Killed the Radio Star, and he'd been a part of it, and then he was in the music video. Go watch the music video for Video Killed the Radio Star. You'll see Jeffrey Downs playing the keyboards in that song. And so, you know, they were, at that time, MTV was able to take this music and just, and they were not a bunch of showmen. And you could watch in the way they did the music videos, you could tell they weren't a bunch of jump around crazy people. They were more trying to make something interesting visually with the way they shot the videos rather than the guys themselves being interesting. So you start going through this track list, and then you have this first one. Now, okay, the way this band formed is John Wetton and Steve Howe connected, and they knew that they wanted to put something together. They started working on music together. Then Carl Palmer, who'd been in Emerson, Lake and Palmer, you know, they found him. They'd gone through a lot of different people trying to figure out how to get this formula together. And then Jeffrey Downs, I think he was the last person to be brought in here. But interestingly, John Wetton and Jeffrey Downs, for some reason, these two guys just got each other. You know, their music styles, whatever it was, they just got it. And so the Heat of the Moment, they had written this whole album. It was pretty much all done. And then at the last minute, they walk in with this one more song called Heat of the Moment. And there's some, and I may be noticing too much, okay? And I do that sometimes, I admit. And if you've watched many of my videos, you'll see that I sometimes put these weird connections together, like, wow, that sounds like this, or this sounds like this, or somebody followed the same pattern. And well, Heat of the Moment has just some very interesting touches related to that Buggles thing. And I just wanted to point these out, because if you look at the first line of Heat of the Moment, the first line of Heat of the Moment was, I never meant to be so bad to you. He's talking about something that happened, you know, something that happened way in the past. You know, well, I don't know if it's way in the past, but in the past. The first line in the Buggles song, Video Killed the Radio Star, is, I heard you on the wireless back in '52. So both of these songs are talking about, you know, the first line is going back to some memory. I never meant to be so bad to you, and I heard you on the wireless back in '52. Those are the first lines of those first two songs. Now, if you get into the second verse of those same songs, what happens in Heat of the Moment? John Wetton says, and now you find yourself in '82. So it's kind of like, once again, he talks about the past, and then he comes, and now we're talking about the present. And in the Buggles song, I heard you on the wireless back in '52, its first line of the second verse is, and now we meet in an abandoned, I think that's it, and now we meet in an abandoned studio. So both of these songs start out with this whole idea of looking at the past. Both of these songs in the second verse talk about now moving into the future. Moving into, not the future, but moving into the present. And both of them have a direct reference to a year. The Buggles was a reference to '52, and Asia was a reference to '82. And I don't know, you know, if that was intentional. Maybe it's absolutely nothing. But I just thought that was such an interesting thing that you had this guy, Jeffrey Downs, who'd been a part of that song Video Killed the Radio Star, and then they had this on their first huge hit off of Asia, kind of had that same lyrical pattern in that song. And I thought that was just kind of cool to have that same kind of thought process in the song. Anyway, the other thing that's kind of interesting about this, and this is important, is that who produced this? They had talked to a lot of different producers about doing this record. I mean, it was, and they finally landed on this guy named Mike Stone. And here's why they picked Mike Stone. I've actually talked about Mike Stone in other videos that we've done here. Mike Stone had worked extensively with Queen. Matter of fact, Bohemian Rhapsody was produced by Mike Stone. So Mike Stone was a well-known entity in the music business, but that's not why they picked him. The reason they picked him is John Wetton listened to Mike Stone, an album that he had just finished doing. And the album that Mike Stone had just finished was Journey Escape. And John Wetton heard what Mike Stone had done on Journey Escape, and it was a no-brainer at that point. They said, what you did here, this is what we envision for what we want to do. And it's hard to deny that Mike Stone just created just spectacular sounding music. It was Escape. If you're a Journey fan, I'm a huge Journey fan, by the way. Matter of fact, interestingly, Journey was my first concert. This was my second concert. I'm a huge Journey fan. And that album, Escape, is just, it's one of the greatest, you know, it's in the top albums ever recorded. It was so amazing from start to finish. And then, of course, Mike Stone produced the next Journey album, which was Frontiers, which was another, you know, great album, great sounding album. And so they wanted to work with Mike Stone, and of course he gave them this just spectacular sounding, just beautiful album. The organization of the songs, the progression, you know, that was the other thing. You know, when you would listen to, back in these days, you would buy an album, but you hoped that the whole album was good. And they would thoughtfully put these albums in an order that would hopefully take you on a journey. And this one really did. I remember, you know, you put the Heat of the Moment on there, and, you know, and it's about this thing about where he's kind of apologizing for something that happened. It was in the heat of the moment. And then Only Time Will Tell is about kind of a breakup and what's gonna happen over time as things split up. And you kind of watch these, you know, the musical things where they'll move you through hard to slow to soft to heavy, once again to kind of take you on this journey as you listen to the album. And this was a fantastic example of the progression of the music. You know, they put these great two songs. I mean, they ended up being two of the hits, but they also happened to follow in a progression really, really well. Soul Survivor might be my favorite song on this album, though. I'm the soul survivor, soul survivor. Oh my gosh. And John Wetton, that's the one that I remember the most from singing them in concert, weirdly, was hearing his voice just cascading over those rocks up outside of Denver, Colorado. You know, you're over there in the the clear sky, and you're looking down over the city. Because if you're at Red Rocks and if you're sitting up at a certain spot, you can actually see down over the whole city down in Denver. It's so amazing up there. And then to see and listen to this up there, it was so incredible. One step closer, step closer. This is, you could really hear some of that progressive rock stuff in this music. And Time Again, that one really has that prog rock kind of feel to it. When you listen to that music, you can just get that sense of where these guys came from. Wildest Dreams, Without You, Cutting It Fine. I mean, these were such great songs. Here Comes the Feeling. This was just awesome. And I mean, so many songs on here. And of course, when I saw them in concert, I was too young to know. I don't remember what else they played, if they played any other cover songs or things from their past. I don't really remember. And so they must have played other stuff besides just what was on the album, because this is barely enough to fill up, 40 minutes. So I remember Carl Palmer did a drum solo, as I recall, and whatever. But, and I also interestingly saw back in the 90s, I was living in Salt Lake City, and Steve Howe, the guitarist who had also, of course, been with Yes, came through Salt Lake City just on a little solo tour. And I went and saw him, and it was just him, I think the whole time he just played an acoustic guitar. That's really all it was. But he actually busted out Heat of the Moment. Da-na-na-na-na-na. And it was pretty cool. Just that this album had such a massive impact on so many people. And it really ended up, for all four of these guys, probably being the biggest thing that any of them ever did. And unfortunately, they never recaptured this on the follow-up albums that they did. The next one was called Alpha. They had 1.5 hits off of that one. Don't Cry ended up being a pretty big song, but that one was rushed. They kind of, when you listen to them talk about this, they regret that what they had to do. They sent him up to Canada. They got him back together with Mike Stone, and we're kind of like, go, go, go. And we need another album. Do it quick. And then they rushed something out, and they kind of all felt like it just fell flat. And similarly, how Heat of the Moment was the last song written for this album, Don't Cry was the last song written for. It was kind of at the end, they said, they listened to the album, and they said, you don't have a hit. So they said, what are we going to do? So they wrote Don't Cry. Anyway, that's a whole nother story. But Heat of the Moment ended up, it was this last minute song. It's so interesting how many bands have that last minute song or that throwaway song that they weren't planning on doing, and it ends up being the song that's the one that's the huge hit. I mean, even bands like Black Sabbath, the album Paranoid? Paranoid was that the album was originally going to be called War Pigs. I mean, if you look at the cover of the album, that makes way more sense than Paranoid. But they got to the very end, and they needed another song. And so Tony Iommi just busted out this simple riff, and they wrote the song Paranoid. It ended up being one of their biggest things. I mean, it may be, from a general public standpoint, the best known song that they ever did. And it was a total last minute, throw it out at the last minute song because they needed another tune. And then, then you write the biggest song of your career, which is kind of what happened here. They just needed another song, and like, and they throw this out, and it's boom, there it is. There's the hit, and something about working under pressure or something. And they're not the only ones to have things like this. There's so many bands that you have where you hear the story of, we weren't even going to do that one. We didn't like the song. I hate that song, whatever. And then it ends up being the one that the public likes. Anyway, so that was an interesting thing here. So this album came out in 80. It came out in 82. And anyway, and then they went on tour, and they were just huge. Let's take a look at the inside here. Of course, you have this cool logo that says Asia, and the S kind of written like a Z, which is kind of neat. And then it has the songs here, who wrote them, and of course it says Heat of the Moment, Only Time Will Tell, Soul Survivor, Wildest Dreams. These were John Wetton and Jeffrey Downs. They were really the songwriting duo here. And then these others were basically listed as songwriting credit, which actually matters. You know, from a publishing standpoint and what have you, being the songwriter, you get royalties are different at that point. That's why, I don't know if you knew this, but you'll see a lot of times you'll have who wrote it, and then you'll have these little companies listed afterwards. Well, these are all publishing companies. Well, what do you mean publishing companies? Well, basically every one of these people has their own publishing company. And so when you write a song, you attach it to your publishing company that's your own publishing company sometimes. A lot of people will sign over their publishing rights and whatever to the record company. But as a songwriter, though, you get certain royalties when the song is played in different areas. And I think I mentioned this before, but I had some songs in some movies years ago, and it's amazing that being a songwriter and owning your publishing, I got royalties on one of the songs I wrote for, well, actually a couple of them for years and years and years. One of them, checks were a lot bigger because it was a featured song where the other ones weren't. But it was amazing. I mean, 10 years after the movie came out, and it was long gone. I mean, no one had even thought about it. It's playing around the world, and I'm still getting royalty checks for this thing a decade after I'd been on this show. So that's a really important thing. That's why you often see in these liner notes, you'll see that, you know, who wrote the song, and you'll see all these little publishing companies listed. And those are people that own the publishing rights that then get royalties as the album is played. Anyway, it's an interesting thing the way the music business works. And it's changed a bit over the years, obviously, with all the digital stuff, but and with less frequent radio play and that kind of thing. But anyway, so then here's the band, and they did, I don't know, just did something interesting, did them upside down and right side up. We'll flip this over here. And then that's the band. You know, it's funny, I'm just recognizing faces. That's Steve Howe, that's John Wetton. This has got to be Carl Palmer, and that's got to be Jeffrey Downs. These weird little black and white photos, these two are obvious. This one, they kind of look similar, at least to me, at least in these pictures. Anyway, I'm pretty sure that's who's who in this picture. So Asia's first album, their debut album, this thing was such a big deal. And I'm curious, you know, if you're close to my age, which I know a lot of the people that watch these videos are, you're probably male and you're probably close to my age. I'm just curious what you thought of this album, because this was, you know, what was interesting for these guys especially was the fact that they were, you know, they were really kind of, you'd think they were going to be a prog rock band, and all these guys, because of the past, except for Jeffrey Downs with the one song with the Buggles, you know, these guys were not kind of rock stars in the traditional sense. And so this was the first time for these guys to really see that, probably see, you know, the teeny bopper crowd actually show up to a concert for them. That wouldn't have been their normal thing, you know, to have teenage girls at their concerts. But once they did this, they were more that kind of a band now. And yet this music was so popular and so powerful that it just it seemed like it really hit everybody. We all kind of got it, and and it shows in the record sales. I mean, you don't sell 10 million records without reaching a lot of people in a lot of different demographics. I mean, you have to hit the general public in a pretty big way to sell that many. So I'm just curious what this album, if you remember this, and what it was to you at the time. So if you like these videos, please like and subscribe to this channel. And also, if you like what we do and want to support us, the best way to do is just go to Audiomover.com, and that's the company that takes old audio and videotapes and converts them into digital. And even if you don't have old audio and videotapes that you need to get converted to digital, you probably know people that do. And so I'd ask you to just go put it on your Facebook page or an Instagram and just mention us, or share this video. You know, tell people about what we do, and if you have people that you remember Asia, go share this video with them. It's amazing to reminisce and to remember these songs and where you were when you heard them, because albums like this were such a big deal to us. Anyway, with that, have a fantastic day.